Good evening, everybody. How you doing? So today is the first in a hopeful series called Bridging the Gap. And the intention of that is to discover areas where there's a gap between political ideologies, religious ideologies, just belief systems in general, where we're being told one thing, but in all reality, it's actually another. The guests on today are good friends of mine. I've known them for years. Um, great people, and they've agreed, thankfully, to come on and talk to me about the things that we wanted to talk about. And I want to give them the opportunity to give their experiences and their feelings about the questions that you guys posed, because I know they're all burning questions in your guys' minds. Because a lot of the questions that, or a lot of the things that we're told in society, especially on news and media, they're just not true. Yeah, they're there to divide and to keep us separated. Man, I can't talk today. Hopefully, this goes better later. But yeah, so I want to introduce everybody. Actually, I'm going to have them introduce themselves. We have Barrett, we have Max, and we have Sam. Thanks for coming, everybody. We'll just start at Barrett and work our way around. Just introduce yourselves and tell us what you do, why you're here, and what you hope to achieve by being here today.
Oh boy. What I do is a very long answer, but my name is Barrett. I am non-binary. I guess I wear a lot of hats as far as what I do. I'm a musician, a tattoo artist. I teach a very specialized form of Japanese rope bondage. And I've been involved with a number of different kind of activism groups over the years, from all the way back in high school, coming up on 20 years ago. Yeah, I don't know what else to cover, but
I guess that means it's my turn
good.
then, huh?
Yeah, Max, you're next.
My name is Max. I am a trans man. That is a really hard question to answer. What I do, I've done a lot of run fair character acting. I apprentice as a blade and blacksmith here where I locate. I just really passionate about giving a safe space to not just the people that I care about, but to ensure a safer space for people like me, like all of us, in the future, I guess. That's what I got.
I'll do it on mine.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Sam. I am a trans female, and I daylight as a male because, sadly, in the great state of Utah, where I reside, I make more money because of a penis. So that's what I represent for myself in the workspace. I am a mechanic for a hospital. So I maintain hydronic systems, boilers, chillers, pumps, that sort of thing. And whatever else they end up needing for trade skills. As for what I do outside of that, ride motorcycles, do personal construction projects, and I love cooking. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming, everybody. So, do you guys think that do you think it's common for news agencies and political bodies to try and segregate us and separate us by beliefs? The reason why I ask that is because I've watched a lot of news, both conservative news and more like left-leaning news, and a lot of comments on the discords that I have are very polarizing by nature. Do you think there's misinformation out there about what we as people who would be considered lefties, do you believe that there's misinformation that is disseminated through the media about what we collectively generally believe? And anybody can answer.
I'll pop in for this one. I think so, and I think it's a longer running tradition than a lot of people probably think. If you look into like the history of labor movements in the U.S., you'll see that there have been books published on how to divide people so that they do what you want them to. And I think if we kind of look, even just focusing on U.S. history, we'll see where these patterns of division kind of pop up, basically from the founding of this country all the way up through now.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I've been an outspoken critic of Citizens United versus FEC, which is when this was in 2011, and this is when the SCOTUS declared that corporations are basically people. And you saw a big shift in how, political parties, because they used to actually cross over, bipartisan lines quite frequently to get laws passed. And then as soon as 2011 happened and Citizens United versus FEC was decided, you saw a massive gap forming between those political differences, and they rarely cross over anymore. And then on top of that, you have a media system, right? Legacy media, so CNN, Fox, these bigger companies went from, in 1968, went from about 72% approval rating to today, which is at 36%. So we obviously, as a collective society, don't trust the media that we're getting, but for some reason we tend to keep quoting it. It seems kind of ridiculous to me to keep doing that. Max or Sam, did you have anything to weigh in on that?
Yeah, sure. So I'd like to propose the idea of othering. Othering being, of course, creating an us versus them situation. It's real easy to do in a political spectrum because what we all believe is very different from what they all believe. And that's just not true. As a people, 75% of the culture might believe one thing, and 25% of that culture might vote on that thing, and the opposing interest, everybody might vote because they might be more avidly verdant for that thing. It doesn't really matter what we're talking about in that spectrum. So othering allows the opportunity of, say, in an extreme environment, Hitler othered Jews. The Jewish community was othered, and in doing so, politicized. Every party others so that they can get more people to join their cause, their ideology.
I'm really, really glad that you said that, because a lot of the channels that I go on and the Discords that I belong to, we talk a lot about the othering and why it's used and how it's used. And as a matter of fact, I'm writing an article right now that actually discusses the act of othering using racial bias. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Max, how about you?
Basically, to tack on a little bit to what Barrett was saying earlier, is that a good way to say it is, if you keep putting divides within divides, there isn't going to be enough people to stand up and actually make a say big enough that people will listen. So that's something that I've seen actually happen a lot in the LGBTQ community. A good example is within the trans community, is like branching from sexualities to different genders, is there is so much contention between all of those communities because of misinformation, because of all of these different things, of not listening to certain outlets or listening to false outlets. It creates almost a wall in the way of trying to make a difference, because everyone's screaming the same thing in different languages, causing an unnecessary divide.
I would say that's incredibly accurate. I think that's definitely a result that we tend to see. So to get into the questions, the first question that I wanted to ask you guys, because this has come up a couple of times in the Discords that I belong to, And that is, let me get onto my questions page here. Does the LGBTQ plus community really want to allow pedophiles or minor attracted people into its rank? What do you say, Barrett? And you can cuss, by the way.
So to be perfectly blunt, absolutely fucking not. That was a rumor. I think it's kind of always been around. I've heard variations of it since years before I ever came out. But one of the things that seems to kind of have really brought it back into the mainstream as far as communication goes has been a lot of stuff on 4chan, which a lot of people I think recognize as kind of like the absolute deepest cesspool of the internet. But a lot of the LGBT people are trying to promote pedophilia or welcome pedophilia. Definitely gained a lot of traction through that message board system. But there's no validity to it whatsoever.
Yeah. I've never heard anybody that we all know ever say anything about that. I've never heard a single word about it. And most of the people that I've talked to have been vehemently against it, even to the point of discussing their own traumatic experience with being assaulted as children. So it makes no damn sense to me why they would want that. I mean, most of the people that we know collectively, because we know a lot of the same people, they're extremely against it. They're extremely vocal. It's one of the very few things that seems like both the left and right agree on. Is like everybody's like, screw pedophiles. We don't want them. Like that's the weird thing that like for some reason nobody actually talks about is like both conservatives and lefts and liberals and everywhere in between. We all hate pedophiles. You know what I mean? Max, Sam, do you have anything to say about to answer the question?
Oh, yeah. So pedophilia is something that amongst, I'm sure the rest of us, I'm strong about the concept. I have no faith in our judicial system. I'm closest likely to libertarianism as it was founded, not in its current iteration.
Yeah.
That being said, I would be a proponent of chemical castration, not because there aren't ways around that, and not because most of that isn't a power play of sorts, but because chemical castration at least ensures that they aren't going to propagate another generation of their own behavioral abuse within their gene pool directly. I mean, there's still aunts, uncles, that sort of thing, but yeah, no, there's zero room in my life for somebody that was charged thus.
Max?
Absolutely fucking not. There is no room, space, want, desire to have pedophiles in any community, whether it be the LGBT community or society. And I feel like when the movement really started to take full force, they used that as a crutch to kind of jump in and say, well, what about me? Well, we count, right? No, our gay marriage was illegal because of people controlling others' wants and desires and just a product of a bad society. Pedophilia is hated no matter what you believe in, kind of how both Steve and Barrett and Sam were saying. It's probably one of the things we can all agree on. And it's really sad because when the maps, or whatever you want to call them, really tried to push for their own space in the LGBT community, it really pushed out a lot of the things that the community was trying to do to make spaces feel more safe. And I feel like it was really detrimental to the growth of our community.
Yeah, I remember when they came up with a flag and I first saw it and I was like, there's no fucking way. There is no fucking way my community is supporting this. And so I just asked around, and I asked some of the people that even worked at the Pride Center, and they're like, "Fuck no, we don't want them here, and we're never gonna advocate for that. Like, no, fuck them, we don't want them here." And so when I started seeing these and like the stories that were being posted in the Discords, it was so hard for me to believe. And the problem with that is maybe we're in a bubble of sorts. But then I talked to other people from other cities. You know, I've got a friend in New York. I've got a friend in California, not in the Bay Area, but in LA. And I talked to them, and they're all like, "Fuck no, there's nobody here is going to advocate for that." So I think this is one of those lies that we get sold, basically, and we're expected to buy it, but I don't think anybody's actually buying it. But unfortunately, when one political group really is dead set on not liking us as lefties, they're going to try and find whatever ammunition they can put in that gun. You know what I mean? So that actually brings me to a good question. What do you guys believe about gun rights?
So I think I fall into the camp of, if you go far enough left, you get your guns back. I think a lot of the discussion about gun control, gun restriction leaves a lot of minority voices out, whether those be racial minorities, gender minorities, sexuality minorities. A lot of those voices aren't listened to or centered in those conversations. And I think if you speak to enough people on the left or enough people that belong to these minority groups, you'll find out that most of them don't support these restrictions. And it's becoming very common in the LGBT community to own and carry firearms for a number of reasons, but I think
especially for trans people, right?
Yeah, I think over the past 6 years, one of the fastest growing demographics for firearm ownership has been trans people. There are a number of trans specific gun clubs popping up across the US. I personally have been a member of several left-wing and like LGBT centric firearm groups. So it's a lot more prevalent than I think a lot of people realize. Those numbers, I'm sure, will just keep going up.
Right. Well, what do you think, Max and Sam?
I am going to actively admit I probably have a lot of biased opinions on this, given I grew up in Chicago around a lot of gun violence. And I personally do not like guns, but I have no problem with other people carrying and protecting themselves. So I don't know if I would have the best and most constructive feedback for this question.
Actually, I think that's extremely constructive, because the perspective is that, as lefties, we want everybody to follow our rules, regardless of anything else, right? But what you just expressed is a very libertarian kind of perspective, where I don't want to do it myself, but I don't want to force other people to have to do something that they don't want to do, which is carry a firearm, right, for self-defense. I think it's actually an incredibly crucial perspective, actually. So, Sam, what about you?
The only firearm I currently possess is a personal carry. I grew up in Texas, and in Texas, you have guns around. It doesn't really matter what your political spectrum is. The people that don't are probably in a big city. It's not just a matter of protection, it's a matter of survival. And when I say that, I don't mean that everybody in a city needs to be able to go out and kill a bird. What I'm saying is that if somebody comes to your door, yeah, a gun's not going to keep you from getting shot, but it could be enough to deter somebody from sticking around because you're both holding guns. I really like the Swiss approach of 2 years mandatory service. I think that if we all had 2 years mandatory service, that would get us the required training and discipline. I don't necessarily advocate for the services. Mind you, I think that we piss money down the drain on that in the Department of Defense/War. However, I do believe in a lot of the people that are in the services, and that's a different story entirely. So absolutely a gun in every hand. That'll give anybody that thinks, oh, I'm going to rob this person because they don't have a gun, and then that person pulls out a gun, they're getting what they're asking for at that point.
What is that old saying? A well-armed society is a polite society. Oh man, great answers, everyone. Let's see here. Let's get to some more questions here. Let's see. I think the biggest one that people really have a difficulty with, and I'm seeing a bunch of those questions basically here, is first of all, let's lead off with talking about what we mean by sex and gender. What are your guys' opinion, and how do we make those distinctions in our lives? Obviously, it's, this is a video for you guys to be able to talk about how you feel about these things. I've always been the proponent of, sex is what's between the legs and gender is what's between the ears. Where do you guys fall on these ideas?
Well, yeah, I've taught a number of classes around this before gender theory became a prevalent part of the psychological discussions and discourses. And it's purely based on the things that I have learned in my life. Mind you, I'm not a doctor. I am not a social worker. Gender is absolutely a matter of self-perspective. Self-perspective is a representation of what you believe about yourself. So it's not what physical characteristics you hold. Physical characteristics can support, or they can almost in some cases violently oppose your self-perspective, the way that you believe of yourself. You can work toward that belief. You can work away from that belief. That's just a matter of who you are as a person. But gender isn't specific. It doesn't have to be. It can be if you want it to be. Say, I was born a white dude, a white male. That's what I was raised to be. It was the best thing for my father to believe about me. And so then I became an independent human, and I changed the way that I thought about myself. Now, I didn't think of myself in that way, but it was expected of me. So that's what I grew up with. Once I became an independent person, I was allowed to express my gender in a different fashion. To say that it's between your ears, yes, but it's also, for me, it's in your heart. It's a confidence of self. It's a way you believe yourself to be.
Nice. Max Barrett?
So, as I have moved further away from my high school and junior high understandings of biology and what we're taught in schools, excuse me, I've learned that both a combination of like advancements in understanding genetics, as well as really just having access to better researched material to read. The concept of like biological sex is a lot muddier of a water than a lot of people realize. Once you start looking at like genotypes versus phenotypes, you realize that it's not clear cut. I mean, especially, I think there was an article published last year about the prevalence of people assigned female at birth who still identify as female in adulthood. giving birth and then having their genetics tested and finding out that their genotype is what was taught as male all throughout school. We're taught that XX is female, XY is male. But then we have all of these people who are quote, biologically women, assigned female at birth, still identifying as female in adulthood. Genetically, they are male. And so we really trying to limit it to like genetics or strictly biology. It's not as clear cut as a lot of people think. And so to me, like saying like sex is what's between your legs versus, your gender being something else. It's a very one-dimensional or two-dimensional approach to what is, a four-dimensional subject. We're leaving a lot of cards out of the deck.
Well, we're not even looking at the other cards at this point, are we?
No, it's it's like playing blackjack. There's a whole big stack of cards that you're not seeing, and all you have is, two. But assuming that the rest of that deck is going to be the same as your cards is you're doing yourself a disservice in that game. But yeah, I think it's a lot less clear cut than a lot of people want it to be, and a lot less clear cut than a lot of people make it out to be.
Max, how about you?
I agree a lot with what Barrett and Sam was saying, but more on the line of intersex. I do believe that both play a really big part in identity, whether it be biological. The chromosomes play a really big play into it, and I can't top what they said because it's basically what I was going to bring up. But you're leaving a lot of cards out of the deck. You're trying to fit. You're trying to fit 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag, expecting to go somewhere. And so it's because I'm a trans man, but I am slowly learning and actually going in to get a genetics test here in the next little bit that I might be under the intersex umbrella. And that poses a lot of different questions, especially for trans or cis folk, because kind of like how Sam was saying, you feel it in your heart. You can't say that. How do I phrase this? You can't. A lot of trans people have these thoughts when they're younger of, well, why can't I go outside without a shirt on like the other boys? I don't understand what the problem is. That's, I feel like, what Sam is saying when she means you feel it in your heart. You know that something is different. You just have to wait till you have your individuality to figure out what terms you're actually feeling. And so I feel like if we had a lot more research done in certain areas, this wouldn't be as hard of a question to talk about, because you can't answer a question in a different language you don't speak, especially if you haven't spoken in a long time.
Right. And that's something that I was really curious about, because, I've had a couple of different conversations, especially recently, where, I challenged others to think of traits that women and men share just exclusively to their sex and genetic makeup, right? So if you were looking at traditional cis people, what are the traits that they share that can't be shared with any of with the other genders, right? So I haven't been able to see any difference between the two, except for the fact that what I've noticed personally, so it's very anecdotal, but cis males, their willingness to do violence, but I don't think that's necessarily genetics. That could be social engineering, right? Social training. We've been taught for so long that men, you are violent, you go off to war, you fight, and you destroy, and you kill and maim, right? And so I think part of what's going on, and obviously I'm not trans and I can't speak for trans people, but from an outside perspective, right, looking in, when we look backwards through history, right, we didn't have the luxury of being able to explore these ideas, right? Because it was mostly about survival, just trying to live, because life was horrible, pre 1900s. We didn't have antibiotics, we didn't have any kind of birth control, we didn't have anything really. Medicine was very primitive in the most basic sense of it. It was very primitive. And so now that we're living longer, medical advancements allow us to live longer, to treat more diseases, all sorts of different things. Now we actually have a luxury to be able to explore those different concepts of what it means to be who we are inside. So do you guys think that would be a kind of an accurate kind of an understanding of why the trans movement has gained so much traction recently?
I agree that our world is changing and in ways that we can't foresee. I would actually argue more that the people that have lived in a lifestyle that they weren't assigned have existed, right? Trans people have existed in history. I mean, you could look at folklore and see that Joan of Arc is a prime example of somebody that was represented as a thing and didn't live that thing. You could talk about any number of tropes, but what I'm going to argue for is information. The internet is a wide and varied and beautiful thing. The printing press is as well. So we have access to information that our ancestors simply did not. So now, as the age of information came about, those of us with like minds are able to discuss how we think, how we feel. Anybody that has this niche idea of what they want for their lives can probably find somebody who has a similar idea or can improve upon that idea. Or maybe that idea existed 600 years ago, and now you're not alone in it. It makes, at least for me, it makes me more comfortable in identifying who I am and how I want to live.
Nice. Anybody else?
To kind of piggyback off of that, there's historically a number of kind of famous people that we, looking through modern understandings back, can identify as trans individuals. A fairly famous one was Anne Bonny the pirate. Exclusively wore men's clothes, was known for drawing a beard and mustache on herself. And when we see these, these are stories from the 1700s, 1800s. There's famous aristocrats in Europe that, were trans. They existed as such hundreds of years ago. It's not a new idea, but it's one that's, I think, viewed a lot more critically now. And I'm sure if I really wanted to, I could probably connect a few dots and come up with an explanation as to why it's a lot more critically viewed. But I will spare that hornet's nest for now. But and even you look at indigenous cultures, there's stories of trans and non-binary and intersex individuals on almost every continent. It's not a uniquely Western experience, and it's not a uniquely recent experience. It's something that we've seen throughout history in every culture. It's just a lot easier to communicate these ideas now, where I can type a message on my phone and send a communication to anyone anywhere on the planet in a matter of seconds. It's a lot easier for ideas and concepts to propagate and expand when that's an option available to you than it is when you had to write a letter and hope that 2 years from now it might get where it was going.
Yeah. Max?
I'm basically going to piggyback off both of those and even address that we have even adapted to using terms like tomboy, of identifying usually younger women as more masculine, like they like to wear jeans and play with the boys and so on and so forth. And so, like, this isn't something that it's actually still going on, and I just don't have a lot to add because going last is not the best.
No, it's all good. It's all good. So
I need to jump in
was
quicker.
no. So that was one of the questions. Was do we think or do we have any opinions on whether or not we are pushing more masculine lesbians and more effeminate men towards trans identities rather than just letting them decide for themselves? Do you think there's a push within our own community to force them into their own boxes, or do you think it's just something that we're seeing more of just because it's more available?
I absolutely think that our community is pushing certain ideologies on us because there's this common term within the trans community called trenders. That came out as a thing when the trans community first started gaining traction, and it was other trans LGBT-esque people getting mad at other trans people for either trans men being too femmy or trans women being too butch. So it's not just the cis community that is pushing these ideologies. Actually, it's quite the opposite. I've met a lot more cis people who were okay with me expressing me the way I want because they didn't have a complete understanding of how certain trans people should act. And that's actually kind of scary because if within our own community we are trying to push our dysphoria in a way on other people, we are completely going back in a hole on ourselves. Basically, we are doing everything that we are trying to stop because the divide. It's, but what about how I see things? But what about this? And well, if a trans man wears makeup, what if it makes me less of a man in my identity? And I think it's just really toxic. It needs to change.
Good answer. Sam?
Yeah. So in a lot of elements, when I say this, I want anybody listening to know that what I'm saying isn't a description of how someone feels about themselves, but a social commentary. So gender is performative. Okay, gender is performative. That means that the way that I present myself is going to tell other people around me how they should view me, right? It's a social construct. That being said, that doesn't change how I feel about myself, but it can change how you see me. For instance, right now, I haven't shaved, right? I'm not wearing any makeup. I haven't done anything with myself, right? I'm either a really, really sloppy female that's got some issues, or I'm just comfortable at home. Or I can just pretend, oh yeah, no, I'm a dude. Everybody believes it because that's just what's expected. I can just do whatever the hell I want. That's my perspective of what I'm allowed to do. But it's held true so far. What happens when somebody looks the part of something that they're told they're not? Are they not treated that way? Right?
Yeah.
It's performative. So if for instance, if I'm going to soften my voice slightly and just raise the pitch a little bit, and suddenly I sound like a completely different person. I can affect a tone, and then I'm suddenly somebody else. It's allowing you to see or hear me in a manner in which I want to be perceived. So when you say anything congruent with forcing, yes, absolutely. Society forces us to do some things in a way that commonly we understand them to be. And that isn't always a bad thing. When I'm working and somebody asks me a question, being absolutely descriptive isn't always the most helpful thing. You gauge what you're telling someone tailored to their knowledge base. So if, say, a nurse walks up to me and asks me why her office is really hot, I can look at it and come back to her and tell her, well, you see, there's this heating element and it's got too much resistance and that's causing, or I can just tell her, there's an issue with the heating unit and I'm going to look into it. It helps her to understand in a way that she'll move on and I'll be able to do my job, right? That's no less performative than how I dress and leave my house.
Gotcha. Barrett?
So I think this is, or at least my interpretation of the question. I think it's one that doesn't really have a definitive answer. I think it's fully possible that people are being, say, like bullied into becoming trans. It's not an action that I have personally witnessed. I have seen a bit more of the other direction, where members of the either cis gay or cis lesbian community are like, why would you want to give up being this to become that and lose out on this group's membership? And I know that there's a lot of transphobia existing within other branches of the LGBT community. And so I could assume, which is obviously never the ideal course of action for anything, but I could assume that part of that transphobia manifests as the belief that some people who exist in these margins, whether it be hyper effeminate gay men or hyper masculine lesbian women, instead of viewing that as beginning stages of transitioning before you come out as trans, before you even fully recognize that as your own identity, I could see people viewing somebody existing within those margins and then later transitioning as being pushed into that transitioning. Because to a lot of people, both LGBT and otherwise, being trans is inherently like not a good thing. And so I think, while I'm not going to say it never happens, I don't personally think it's as common as some people probably make it out to be. And I think some of that is the transphobic bias that exists in some of these communities, whether it's like, intentional or not. It's the difference between, implicit and explicit bias. That bias still exists.
Right. So what I'm gathering is it's to identify as trans is incredibly individualistic, right? So it's I guess you would say it's the libertarian form of individualism that we really kind of, as libertarians, we want, right? We want hyper focus on the individualization of the person, and less of the group think, right? So, and then Barrett, what I'm getting from you is that there's some of the reasons why, and correct me if I'm wrong here, some of the reasons why we might see those things happening is because we're still subscribing to the same gender constructs even within these groups, and they force us or elicit a response to us to others even within the other groups. Is that kind of what you mean?
Absolutely. That's definitely a factor. We might be a marginalized group within society, but we are still in society. And so all of the problems that exist in society are going to exist in these smaller subsets of that larger whole.
Right, because we're human beings.
Yeah. And to use a localized geographical reference, there's 100 ways to get from Salt Lake to Ogden. At the end of it, you leave Salt Lake and you're still going to end up in Ogden.
Yeah. I've heard that before. So that kind of leads us into one of the other big questions was children and schools. Let me see if I can get the correct answer here, or the question here, because I want to be specific about what they're asking. There's so many good questions though. Let's see. What are their perspectives on educating children in elementary schools about what trans is, and how do they take into account child development in that perspective? What are their thoughts on potential contradiction between gender reconstruction surgery and the idea that gender is a social construct? Yeah, the rest of that question kind of reaffirms the first of it. And I think kind of what that question, there's kind of a couple of different components to that question, really, which is part of it is gender construction theory. Is like, okay, well, if gender is a construct, why do we use hormones, right? Why do we change our appearances so drastically? Max, what do you think?
Well, I would want to address teaching transgender in school, because I can make the argument of, well, we're taught from a very young age that men and women, the birds and the bees talk. And if we're going to be talking about that in schools, I think we should be talking about everything, because if we don't, then we're going to end up in the same situation we are in now currently, with misinformation, lack of research, lack of education, lack of awareness, which is the biggest thing that I feel personally has affected our society in a very negative limelight. And it's not that we're forcing it in schools as much as we're giving people opportunity to learn, which is the whole point of school, or at least certain schools like college, et cetera, et cetera. And we could make the argument that even like sexual health, gender and sexuality aside, isn't even talked about nearly enough in schools when it comes to sex education. So that is a huge issue in and of itself, cis and trans included. But I feel that I have a very different view when it comes to gender reconstructive surgery, specifically in kids. There are benefits when it comes to transitioning before puberty, because it makes a transition easier on the body, given when you go through puberty, that's when the body is being introduced to all of those fun hormones that we get to deal with in middle school and such. But I honestly don't agree with it. because there are a lot of people who battle with if they're trans or not. That I have heard a lot more stories about people who decided to detransition because they started hormones. And I've also heard detransition stories from people who started testosterone or HRT after the age of 18. So I'm going to preface with that. I have heard a lot of people say that they wish that they didn't until they had reached a certain age, because, well, where it helps with physical transition, there are things that the mind needs to go through. I feel you go through a lot of perspective changes from the ages of 13 to, I would even say, as far as 30, that would really affect that transition. I definitely don't believe in gender like reconstruction surgery under the age of 18. And that's my personal preference. You're going to hear a lot of other trans LGBT people argue me tooth and nail on that, but they are entitled to their own opinion, and just like I am. And so, yeah, that's what I have to add.
Groovy. Sam or Barrett?
Yeah. So children, I really like the idea of delayed pubescence. I don't think that it's right if a child says, "I am not this thing," then when the natural course of events is to let their body do that thing. This is from my own personal experience, mind you, so I'm not going to tell any parent what to do with their kid. But I can say that I wish I didn't develop muscles and stretch marks along my shoulders because of quick advancement muscles and dropping my voice 4 octaves. I would have loved the opportunity to start to figure out who I was before my body changed. As for the difference between social constructs and reconstructive surgery, well, sometimes it's nice to have something that helps you get through your day, like LASIK, for instance. Is it nice to not have to wear glasses anymore? Some people choose to, some people choose not to. I leave that up to the individual, like with everything, in my opinion. But I can say that if somebody wants to do that and it makes their life easier and happier, why would you argue against it? I mean, if it's not harmful to that person or anybody around them, I don't see why they shouldn't have the option available to them. I don't think a child under the age of 18 should have constructive or reconstructive surgery around that. But then again, we do it at birth. We have reconstructive surgery for babies all the time when they don't meet what should be a normal physical appearance in the societal construct's eyes.
And let me chat on that for a second. One of those things is circumcision, for example. Like, my parents made the decision without me. I'm not mad at my parents. You know what I mean? It was the socially, common thing to do at the time. But at the same time, it's like, that choice was taken from me. And it's just a piece of skin, but that was my skin. From what it sounds like, what you're saying is that you want it to be more of an individual based decision making process rather than collective. Is that accurate? Okay. Barrett, what do you have to say on this?
So I think I have a lot of thoughts, but I think when we, if we're going to view school in line with kind of the reason that we're fed from young children is that school is to prepare us for real life. Why would we then withhold information that could be useful to children as they're growing up? like in my personal journey, I knew from a very young age that I did not fit into the male box and I did not fit into the female box. So where did that leave me growing up? I didn't know of anything else. You know, I'm a round peg trying to fit in either a square hole or a triangle, and it's not working. So
Yeah.
like if
Go ahead. I wanted to talk about that because I've got another example that's very similar to yours regarding a friend, Cody. But yeah, please finish.
Yeah, I think like from a strictly like mental health perspective, informing kids that you don't have to fit into column A or column B isn't going to harm anybody. It's going to be beneficial. You know, I felt othered for a number of reasons as a very young child. And the first time I tried taking my life, I was in the second grade. Like, had I had the resources that I have now, back then, I could have gone a very different route. But I didn't fit in where people were trying to force me. And I think, actually, I'm willing to say with certainty that I'm not the only person that has lived that experience. Especially when you look at suicide rates among LGBT and especially trans teenagers, at almost triple the rate of veterans. Like, it's obvious that we're failing this group of people, and I think better education and inclusion in that education would go a long ways to helping that. I'm also in the camp of like puberty blockers as being a positive thing. Within 3 months of stopping taking them, you're right back where you were before. It's not a long-term thing. It's not a permanent thing, but it gives somebody the opportunity to make that decision for themselves. And I think at the end of the day, that's the most important perspective on that choice is of the individual who has to make it. It's not my place to decide if somebody is going to transition. It's not, any of your place. It's not any of the people watching's place. It's the person who has to go through that has to decide that. And they should have the time that they want and need to make that decision as informed as possible. As for surgeries, I have to wait until I'm 18 to get a tattoo. I have to wait until I'm 18 to get LASIK done. Outside of essential medical procedures, there's not a single one that I can get before 18. And that's not to say that transitioning is necessarily a cosmetic procedure. I think it's very much a medical procedure, but even surgery is a deeply personal choice. There's people who go their whole lives as trans and never get surgery because they don't want to. It's not what they need to feel whole in their body. But I think for a number of people, once you get to that place where that is what you feel you need, you're going to do what you need to do to get that, whether it's, waiting past any given age mark or, finding a doctor who will do it discreetly. It's not unheard of for people to go to unsafe and great lengths to get medical procedures they need if it's not readily and safely available through proper channels.
Yeah. So there's a member of our Discord group, and I can speak of this because they've spoken of it publicly. So, but they grew up, they're on the autism spectrum, but they never felt like they fit into either gender binary, and so they grew up their whole life just feeling like they didn't fit in. And then when puberty hit, their voice dropped. Like they have a very low, beautiful voice, but they just never felt like they fit in anywhere. And they received, because they're racialized as Black, they received a lot of criticism because they didn't fit into all the little boxes that society wanted them to fit into. Right, and this was extremely harmful to them personally, and it's still a deeply personal thing for them to talk about, because I mean, there was just a lot of harm that came of that. I'm sure there was bullying, there's teasing, there's, forcing someone to fit into, society's mold that they don't fit into. So my personal belief, going along what you guys are talking about, we already do sex education in schools. Like it's not uncommon. So why not include the fact that there are people that don't fit the gender binary? Like, I don't know what most people think is being taught in schools as far as sex education, but I don't see a problem with having a discussion saying, well, there's male, there's female, there's both, and there's other. Why can't we talk about those things in those contexts? But for some reason, it seems like politically, one side wants us to believe that we're talking about like teaching children how to do things and grooming young children from elementary school, which is absolutely fucking ridiculous. It's a ridiculous accusation that schools are going to do this. You know what I mean? You might have like one example in Tennessee or one example over here, but that is not constituent of the whole. You know what I mean? And so it's frustrating to see arguments like that where it's like, okay, that's one small, very, very small group of people over there doing that. But then you want to enlarge that and put that on the larger community of, lefties or LGBTQ people. Like it seems like an incredibly dishonest practice to incorporate when trying to attack other people. You know what I mean?
I can say, having attended sex ed in 3 different states, it is very clinical. There is not any kind of grooming or like suggestion of doing this or going down this route. This is what happens if ABC. This is what happens during puberty. This is the course of embryonic development. It's all very cut and dry. And, between California, Utah, and Nevada, never once did I hear any suggestion of really anything outside of abstinence, and nothing outside of heteronormativity. There was no deviance from that. This is the course. And granted, that's been a long time, but I don't think things have changed very much since, the early 2000s. I can't see there having been a drastic shift into encouraging kids to embrace any form of queer identity.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we're all pretty much. Oh yeah, go ahead, Sam.
I actually just had an argument with a coworker 2 days ago about this. I don't consider myself to be politically leaning in either direction, but he is very much of the mind that he is a conservative male, and more power to him. I really don't care what somebody does with their day. Unfortunately, he tried to tell me that I am going to teach my little girl how to be a miscreant and the devil. He almost got fired for it. I wasn't the one that reported him. That being said, nobody's trying to teach your children how to have sex, okay? Any child should be able to wear whatever color shirt they want. If it's a cut and a style and these things aren't harmful to themselves or others, Try not to politically charge something that is simply a matter of wearing a pair of shorts. I mean, if the shorts can't be worn because you're going to march through a field and the snake will bite you, then have them wear pants. But outside of that, what are you trying to teach this kid that they need to be more of or less of? Just let them wear a freaking tutu unless it's going to get caught in a machine. Come on. Outside of safety and health, why regulate that child's clothing? If their parent says go for it and it's not going to be harmful, then who cares?
I would also love to add something to that, as there's no way that this isn't going to sound bad. As someone of the younger generation, I have been in 2 different sex ed classes, both in Chicago and here in Utah. So I have a different perspective, because what I learned in Chicago was very different from what I learned here. And in a surprising way, it was a lot more cut and dry, kind of like how Barrett was talking about when I learned in Chicago. And here was a lot different. I learned not just the basic cut and dry, but something that I noticed was a big difference was a lot more talk on STIs and STDs, because kind of how what Barrett was saying earlier, like nothing other than abstinence, that is the only thing I noticed slightly changed, and still not enough, because they really didn't go in detail on like how bad certain STDs can be. They just basically were like, here's this is what the symptoms are. Now don't have sex and you won't get this scary thing. And so it's like, they're like, you could use this thing called a condom and this is how you use it. But if you're just going to be safe, don't. Because we are still in Utah. And so it kind of goes back on my topic earlier, what I was saying of like in sex education, everyone is so worried. It's like, oh, if we taught sexuality and gender in these sex classes, we are pushing these ideas into these kids' heads. And I can make the exact argument of, do you not want your cut and dry system to be messed up? Because you're doing exactly that when it comes to man and woman. And it seems like people are getting so upset over something that's already happening, just not the flavor that they like.
I definitely like that explanation. There's so many there's so many bloody good questions, and I'll try to get to as many as I possibly can. But really, some of the viewers really are offering really great questions. Let me see here. So another question has come up too before. I wish I would have included it so I could prepare you guys, but what do you guys think about the so-called political polarization of our universities and institutions? And what do you think about people like Jordan Peterson and where they stand in all of this? Because I mean, obviously, we have to talk about Jordan Peterson at some point in time, because he's such a big name in this whole conversation. And I think he's been misrepresented. I don't necessarily agree with all of his views, but I do think he's been misrepresented on a couple of occasions. But what do you guys think about it? Max, what do you think about Jordan Peterson and the polarization of the universities?
I don't hate Jordan Peterson, which a lot of people will, especially trans people, will get up in arms about. I agree exactly what you said. There are things that I do agree with when it comes to Jordan Peterson, and there are things that I just don't, which you can say about any person who decides to speak out on politics or any contentious subjects. And so I feel honestly he's very misrepresented, and a lot of people when they speak out politically are, because they're in the limelight. Their words are going to be picked apart no matter what they say, and it goes back into having access to that research and understanding. A lot of the people who are getting upset at what he's saying aren't understanding what he's trying to say, so they're taking these ideologies and they're flipping them in their head because they've never come across these kind of topics before, and they're perceiving it from their own view of knowledge, which is super detrimental. When it comes to colleges and universities, I feel like that's always been a really big problem, because especially Utah's a great example of that with BYU. Uh, they
They have not behaved well for a while.
No, that's putting it nicely. And
Yeah.
so, and that's just a good example. And BYU is not the only college that is so opinionated, to the point where colleges and universities first started off as certain of them where you could explore knowledge to be yourself. College was once known as a place where you found yourself, but it is now in our day and age become so heavily politicized that it's no longer about education. It's about, well, I'm learning this and I know this, so apparently I'm better and know more. And that's just not helpful to
And
any
that sounds a lot
situation.
like, yeah, that sounds a lot like orthodoxy and a lot less like heterodoxy.
And yeah, exactly. And I feel that colleges and universities are slowly becoming as opinionated as high school. It's all turning into this,
Oof.
well, I fit in this clique and I fit in that clique and I believe in this and I can't hang out with those people because I don't believe in that. And it's no longer about education and coming into yourself and finding where you belong, or want to belong, I should say, in society. And it just needs to change.
Yeah. Sam Barrett?
So I am of a very different opinion regarding colleges and their role. As we look back through kind of the role of colleges, whether they be Europe or in America, it was always kind of a point of setting yourself above other people. Originally it was only wealthy men. And then after years of struggle and protest, wealthy women were allowed, but only if you were white. And then it was later all black universities were established, where non-white people were finally afforded the same degree of education, even if it didn't come with the same amount of social prestige. And it's kind of always been a I'm better than you piece of paper. And I don't really think that's changed entirely too much over the years. I think the cost has definitely gone up, and the value of that paper has gone down. I mean, now what would require you to get a decent job years ago would have been an associate's degree, and now really even a master's degree is getting you an entry-level job where you can't really afford rent in Salt Lake.
or
So
anywhere in Utah.
Yeah, I think Salt Lake is averaged at about 40% over market, with Ogden about 60% over market. So Utah is horrific as far as cost of living goes. But I think the idea of college being where you find yourself is a relatively new one. Realistically, one that's kind of only really come into kind of common parlance during probably most of our lifetimes. I think the 80s is really when college as a way of finding yourself became a popular idea. And I think that it still very much is. I think it's a lot oriented towards experimenting and kind of finding what you want to do with your life. But I don't know that it's necessarily finding out specifically who you as an individual are. And I know plenty of people who have come out of these quote liberal colleges who have, very staunch right-wing beliefs or very staunch libertarian beliefs. And so the idea that these universities are all turning very left and are indoctrinating everybody who comes through their doors, it doesn't hold water to at least my personal experience, and the things that I have personally observed, which, admittedly anecdotal evidence holds minimal weight, but it is still it's still a factor to my life and my perspective if I have only seen this happen versus hearing that this other thing is happening. As for Jordan Peterson, I think there was a comment in the chat about how he's really only smart on one subject, and I will tentatively agree with that. I think in the world of psychology, he's probably pretty decently educated. He has shown kind of time and time again to not really know much about biology, to not really know a lot about sociology, which you would think some of that would have bled over because it's kind of a parallel field to psychology. But he speaks on a lot of subjects and uses really big words, which I think gives the impression of being better informed and better educated on those subjects. But most of it's just his opinion. He speaks from a position of, this is what I think, and here is a vocabulary to distract you while I give you this opinion. Having personally watched and listened to a few different talks he's given, I think he has pretty appalling views on women and racial minorities and the trans community. And I fall under two of those categories. So it's not really appealing to me to support somebody who is, making comments on more than one occasion of, women are solely interested in Middle Eastern people because they're barbaric and will dominate them. And it's like, that's a pretty shitty thing to say. And there are at least 2 videos on his own Twitter page where he makes that assertion. So it's troubling to me as somebody of, Arabic descent who is trans to hear somebody say that, because I present masculine and my lineage is Arabic, that I am domineering and barbaric, because that's not who I believe myself to be. And I think, you've known me for 4.5 years. I would hope that's not the perspective that you have of me either. But to be kind of like pushed into that shoebox is very frustrating to me.
Yeah, I don't see it that way at all. I don't know the tweets that you're talking about, but there was one video where he was asked, do you believe trans women are women? And he said no, because I believe in XX chromosome, or I believe genetics matter and blah 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 blah. But he then continued on. A lot of the sound bites cut the next part of that conversation off, which is, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that people that don't fit into a strict gender binary don't have the rights and should be treated poorly. So there's times where he's said very what we would consider transphobic things, but then goes on to support the idea that they still are human beings and individuals and should be respected as such, right? But then other views of his, so he kind of moves around a little bit and contradicts himself sometimes. But I think is like an enemy of trans people could probably be better found in other places.
I think to temper that comment, he might say that he believes that people should be able to exist as they are, but he's also very publicly stated that he's going to use the pronouns that he thinks are correct. And I would like to posit that intentionally using the wrong pronouns, intentionally misgendering somebody because they don't fit your idea of what this box is supposed to be identified as, that is a willful and intentional disrespect that he is giving to somebody.
Oh, yeah. And
intentionally disrespecting somebody on those lines is transphobic. So like he can say that he respects their right to exist as such, but he is also, through his own actions, intentionally disrespecting their right to exist as such. At which point, like, his words are meaningless to me because his actions are showing the opposite.
Gotcha. Sam, what's your opinion? Oh, sorry. Let's hear from Sam and then we'll get back to you, Max.
I don't listen to Jordan Peterson. The one time I tried, it was on a topic that he was being, I think, grossly rude about. I think it was obesity he was speaking on. And there's reasons people have weight loss issues that are medically oriented that may have nothing to do with their lifestyle. That was pretty much the end of my interest in Jordan Peterson. So with that, I'm ignorant of pretty much everything he said. Do you mind being more specific in the question?
Well, he's just been a very controversial person in the topic of, trans language, trans rights, stuff like that. So I was just curious if you had any, and many of the people were just kind of curious how trans people feel about Jordan Peterson and also the polarization in universities. So there's nothing specific that I could give you. But
polarization in universities I can speak to, some interest area that I have. That is to say, it depends on the college that you're in. Each college within a university represents a different area of study. That being said, if you are in the gender studies college, yes, you are absolutely going to be in a lefty college. If you're in the business school, you're not getting a democratic argument. I guarantee it. That's the school I went to. And so conservatives reign supreme.
No.
It is what it is. People are going to have their opinion no matter where you're at. Each person that teaches is going to have their own opinion about the world. Each area of study may or may not have a stereotypical or organizational spot in the spectrum, the political spectrum. You might have more people that identify in phys ed, the studies, say, growth and development. They could fall anywhere on the spectrum. It's just an individual identities perspective. Anytime I hear someone talk about how colleges aim toward, well, it depends on the college too, because each college is in its own a collection of people that may or may not have a specific like-mindedness. There's a lot of division within students that go to those colleges. you're going to end up with discourse that's outside the norm, because the idea of college, in my opinion, is to break down what you know, analyze it, put in hopefully more factual information than you started with, and then organize it into a more cohesive perspective. That's my opinion of what a college is for. And so you can call poli-sci, political sciences, an organization for any branch of politics. At the end of the day, it really will come down to the individual.
Nice. I have no perspective on it because I've never gone to university before, so I don't have a personal opinion on it. But it seems to me that going back to what Barrett was talking about, though, is that for a long time, universities were considered, gatekeeping establishments for the wealthy. And then you saw that kind of turn on its head a little bit, for maybe 2 or 3 decades, and it was super cheap to go to school. You could afford an entire year of college on, a summer job, on minimum wage almost, and it was actually fairly, inexpensive. And now it's gone back to the other way, where now it's so bloody expensive. I couldn't even afford going to school on my income, and I don't make bad money. You know what I mean? And so now it's gone back again to being a gatekeeping institution, as far as I can see. I don't know how much of that is true, but it seems kind of on the face, prima facie, that seems to be somewhat true. And then on top of that, they did discriminate heavily against, women and racialized Black folk and other individuals. And for a long time, it was a white institution only. So, yeah. What there was another question that I'm going to rephrase, but the spirit of the question still remains is how do you guys feel about conversations, like regarding feminism and, men's advocacy and all of that stuff? Where do you guys sit on those things? Because I mean, I've made it no secret that I'm a men's right advocate, a men's right activist, and I'm also a feminist, because I believe you have to be both of those things to be able to do it correctly. But where do you guys sit on these topics of conversation? And if I'm assuming correctly, and if you share the same way I do, or share the same view that I do, I think the trans activism, or the trans advocacy, excuse me, we're not having enough conversations about those globally in the same vein that we are with feminism and men's right activism, or advocacy, right? So almost tipped that over. So you see a lot of the conversations either about feminism or about men's right advocacy, but we're not hearing a whole lot about trans advocacy. And there's not a whole lot of studies being done to kind of give us the majority, or the bulk of the information that we really want to have in our hands. What do you guys think about that? Anybody can go.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Max. Go ahead.
Well, how I'm interpreting the question is, I would say that I am a feminist just as much as I am a men's right activist, especially because I've had the unique experience of being a minority. Sadly, I have to say that, on both ends of the spectrum, because being a woman is a minority and being trans is a minority, sadly. I agree that there isn't a lot when it comes to trans rights, but I would assume why that hasn't been talked on more as of late in the development of the trans community and men's rights, which should not have taken so long to be in the limelight, is maybe because of inclusivity reasons. Is, well, people are lumping like men's rights with trans men and women's rights with trans women. And where that is inclusive and can be beneficial to certain degrees, it's not in the ways that a trans man is not going to think the same way as a cisgendered man because of the way they were brought up. To a degree, I know I am a man and I've always felt like a man, but I don't really have the terminology and the childhood experiences to describe what being a man is like. And that's not a lack of experience, it's a lack of knowledge. And so I feel that we really do need to focus more on trans rights and focus on doing more research in that area so that we can actually benefit men, women, trans men, and everyone in between. Because what do we... And that's the hard part, is where do we start? Where do we start to gain this information? Because this is a field that we really don't have much to draw from, because there hasn't been enough rights for women established and there hasn't been enough rights for men established. So if we don't even have those two fields covered, how are we supposed to make a new one?
Sam Barrett?
Sure. So I was raised by somebody that believed that feminism was an attempt at feminizing America. Whether or not that's true, I honestly don't care. What I do know is that what I've been informed of by people that call themselves feminists is feminism is a way to empower people to express being feminine without being less than themselves. I believe that to be true. In that same regard, I think that's true for people that represent masculinity. I hear it called men's rights. You could call it masculinism. It's really no different, but to describe somebody as masculine is generally not a negative construction. You can call women masculine in a negative capacity. That's also, I think the term I would use is bigoted, because you're now describing somebody based on how you judge them instead of the content of their character and their mind. But that's again a personal opinion. So what I'm hearing is less a description of how I relate to these concepts and more a breakdown of what the concepts are. Men's rights, women's rights, you can call it human rights. You can try and remove the aspects of race and gender, and at the end of the day, we're still having the same discourse, the same arguments. Yes, everybody deserves to have these things in their life, right? These basic rights, these basic principles. It's the ones that don't have those things that need those things. So those are the ones we focus on, right? Masculinism isn't a necessary topic of discourse because masculinity is perceived to be a desirable trait. Feminism is not necessarily perceived to be positive or desired. So that's what we call this thing that we support. Men's rights are important because single fathers deserve access to their children. Single mothers are granted that access. So we don't talk about single mothers' rights about that area. We talk about single mothers' rights for wages, which falls under the category of feminism. So you can piece it all and pick it all apart. But at the end of the day, I go to work as a man because I make more money. Women deserve to be paid as well as men do. As a trans female, I would like to be able to go to work in the way that I would like to go to work and still make at least the same amount of money. But I can't, so I don't.
Barrett?
So I know we've had these conversations one-on-one before, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I very openly identify as a feminist because the understanding of feminism that I have always had, that through my research of feminism, my studying of feminism, it's been the pursuit of equality between genders. Not necessarily the advancement of women per se, but evening out the playing field. And that door swings both ways. You know, trying to push the view that men and women are equal in all things opens up the possibility for men to be single parents, for men to be viewed as nurturers and child rearers. It tries to dispel the notion that men aren't capable of the emotional expression necessary for raising children. And so to me, like, all of those things, like access to mental health, being a single parent, all of the things that men aren't quite, equal under current societal views, still fall under feminism. Like, that's always been my understanding of feminism. And, like Sam, I was also raised by parents who, at least, I don't know what my dad's view on it was, but my mom is very openly anti-feminist, which is so odd to me because she has been a worker the entire time I've known her. She votes in every election cycle. And these are all things that she wouldn't have if it wasn't for feminism. But because she has this more conservative upbringing, she doesn't view those as traits of feminism. She views this as an organization or a movement to feminize the U.S. And it's not. And I think it kind of falls under the category of the loudest voices in the room don't always have the most important things to say. And so we get a lot of misdirection, and especially now where we exist in a space where anybody can say anything under any name, and people will just take that as gospel. And so you have articles and writings and blog posts and everything else coming out from anonymous authors saying, this is what feminism is pushing for now. And it's like, okay, but it's not. And you can't show me anywhere with an actual feminist's name attached to it where that is being said. But now here it is out in the ether, and people are, latching onto it. And I think some of that's confirmation bias, but, a lot of it is, I'm sure, a whole plethora of other things. As for like men's rights and MRA stuff, I think there's a lot more of a negative connotation because some of the blogs that are directly attached to the names of people who identify as men's rights activists aren't pushing for ethical things.
Right. Well, MGTOW is a disgusting group, in my opinion. I don't support MGTOW at all. I think they push some very toxic behavior, and it's just gross, very gross, some of the things that they talk about.
Yeah, and I wish that they were the only group doing that, but unfortunately, and I'm sure you've probably seen it, they are not. But then also, like, one of the things that has always struck me as funny is not the right word, but it's the closest word that works, is when you look at who is going to bat for these these men's rights in court, it is more often than not feminist groups. Like when you look at the people suing states so that single men can have custody rights for children, it's not usually groups that identify, at least not publicly, as men's rights advocacy. It's feminist groups. And I'm sure I could probably send you dozens of articles about just that, given a day or two to rally up some stuff. But I think, at least to me, like that kind of reaffirms what feminism is actually about. And that's, equality between everybody on the gender spectrum, which then kind of also spurs my frustration with, trans exclusionary feminism, for obvious reasons. If the movement is equality, why are you kicking somebody out of equality?
Right. It makes no damn sense, does it?
No, it's wanting the name without wanting the actual work.
Right. Well, and if you look in the comments, you'll see Coach Love in the crew live. Coach Love is someone who she's a beautiful and amazing human being. And we've been working together for some time for masculine positivity and really kind of highlighting the places that men and women can both work together. I mean, you couldn't find a more polarized couple going and venturing through these conversations than a racialized white atheist and a racialized Black Christian. You know what I mean? And so we go into these places and we talk about men's rights and male positivity, and we also talk about feminism as well, and what our role is to ensuring that equality does continue to be on the forefront of the conversation. As a matter of fact, we're actually having a web seminar here on, oh good grief, what was the date? It was June 18th on her channel. You can go to Coach Live and Coach Love and the crew live. We'll be talking to a couple of different people about men's advocacy and men's mental health, which is something I'm really a big supporter of, because there's just a lot of things that men and trans men both suffer with. Unfortunately, I don't have a voice that I can speak for trans men, and I don't want to, because I don't ever want to misrepresent them. I want to build their voice. So if I can help them build their voice, I will absolutely do that. But I don't want to put words in their mouth in the vein that I have no idea what it's like to live as a trans man. I know what it's like to live as a cis man, because I was socialized from birth to do that. Right. And so I would love to hear your perspectives on what it means to be trans Max, if you would, because absolutely. I think you have a valuable experience here where you've transitioned from one to the other. So what is that, at least publicly, because you've always been masculine, right? But yes. You're transitioning publicly, because that's kind of what transitioning is it's publicly transitioning away from, the socialization of what we were born as.
It's basically taking off the mask that you learned how to act as an adolescent. And I'm gonna preface this with, I don't know what it's like to be a cis man, so my experiences are going to be very different. I was raised as a cis woman, but I feel that my experiences as a trans man, well, they are going to vary from other trans men, but specifically because of where I grew up. I grew up in a very Black heavy centric neighborhood and around a lot of minorities. And I grew up in an area that really fought to create and to thrive in a very hustle bustle kind of way. So I was raised to kind of be myself, which not a lot of people get the privilege of. And so I grew up hanging out with a lot of guys because, fun fact, I didn't understand women. Who would have thunk? News to me. But I've experienced a lot of hate, and it's not from cis men, which a lot of people will find surprising. Most of the hate that I have gotten has been from cis women and the trans community. I have always been what you would consider a tomboy, whatever you want to call it. I was always very masculine. I never liked wearing girly things. They made me feel what I could only describe as weird and uncomfortable. I never understood that I was a cis woman, I guess. I just was always me. And I was told throughout my childhood that I was very aggressive and very butch. And I was always told I never acted like a woman. So that being said, I really don't know how to speak on what it's like to be a trans man, because I can't even speak on what it's like to be a woman. I have the parts. I have some of the chemicals that benefit estrogen, but I have explained my experiences to other cis men, and they agree with me. The classic trope of obliviousness. Lots of men can't tell when they're being hit on, and it's not that they're oblivious. It's they aren't used to that kind of attention the way that women are. So that's just not an experience that they get at an early age. And if they do get it, it's very, very different, very, very different than the attention women would get. And so I would say, is there any specific questions you would have that I could elaborate on when it comes to the differences between cisgendered men and trans men? Or if anyone has questions.
None that I could think of right now. Perhaps that's a good opportunity to come together and have a second show on this topic. But as the final question before we have our closing statements, the other big question that is on everybody's mind all the time, because it's such a big one in news and on social media, is trans women in bathrooms. I keep coming back to this in my own personal thoughts, and I'm like, why is that such an issue? Because we don't hear anything about the dangers of trans men in men's bathrooms. Why is that? Well, it all comes down to this fear of the penis. You know what I mean? Which I find extremely offensive. It's just, it's like saying, because I have a penis, that means I can't control myself, or I have nefarious, purposes for being in there. And I find it's just an incredibly offensive conversation as a cis guy. So what do you guys think, Sam?
Yeah, so that is something I can relate to on one side, but also there is not a single woman I have ever met in my life that doesn't have some kind of a story about a guy that did something or said something that made them so incredibly uncomfortable that they had to look for either a group or go home or some kind of a self-defense aid to keep on them. I get it. I had the privilege of growing up a relatively well-muscled guy, and so I never had to worry about defending myself. And so every time I talk to a cis female friend that tells me about how they had to go home from the bar by themselves and it was really scary, it makes me, that's what comes to my mind whenever I think about this argument. Trans women like myself that have muscle can be intimidating. But on the other hand, men don't necessarily find themselves in fear of other men raping them. They can certainly. Don't take me to mean that none of them do. But when that fear exists, that you're going to get mugged, men are taught not, in my experience, how I grew up, we're taught not to put yourself in a situation where that's going to happen. And so the onus that's involved is more you need to buck up and figure out how to defend yourself for men. I can't speak to how women are taught, but what I can do is say that anytime I go into a women's restroom, if I'm representing myself in a way that's socially acceptable, I don't catch any flack. I don't even get second looks. In fact, mostly I get compliments. It's really flattering. So whenever I hear someone say that trans women shouldn't be in women's bathroom, it sounds more like a calculated like political statement than it is about a genuine fear.
I would love to add on this because actually me and Sam were talking about this a few days ago. And I made a point is growing up, I heard so many horror stories of women assaulting women in locker rooms and men assaulting men in locker rooms. And I posed this idea of food for thought. If people are actively worrying, and this is a very outlandish, very exaggerated point, but it's still a food for thought of what's stopping a woman with a strap on from doing the same exact thing that a trans woman could do and having that fear. And just kind of like Sam's point is like, what's stopping men from doing the same thing to other men? Just because you have a penis doesn't mean you don't have hands or other things that could do the same thing. It's just hateful.
Forgot I was on mute. Sorry. So this is Cody. I really wanted them on today, but they had other things that they had to do, and they are one of my favorite people. But they posted this as well in the comments. They were assaulted in the boys' room by other boys. So, yeah. I'm going to let you guys finish talking. So, were you done, Max? Okay, Barrett, what do you think?
So I agree that I think largely these statements are political posturing. And I think some of it is kind of humanity's inherent fear of things that are different from, oneself. And that goes for so many categories that we can kind of like put people into. People have a fear of other ethnic or racial groups. People have a fear of other religious groups. People have a fear of other genders. It's the fear of things that aren't like me. And I think for obvious reasons, that's something that we need to get past in a modern society. But I think like when you actually look into the statistics and the history of like assaults and trans people, you'll see that the odds of being assaulted by a trans person anywhere, whether it be a public restroom or an alley or a bar bathroom, your own apartment, anywhere, are extremely minute.
Yeah, there's like a 0.0 some number probability of that happening. It's like stupid small.
I'm not going to say it's never happened, but I can't think of a single instance in my lifetime hearing about it happening. On the inverse, though, the likelihood of a trans person being assaulted either sexually or otherwise is pretty significantly high.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you ever want to read something disgusting, look into the trans panic laws that exist in 38 separate states. That's, something I try and educate people on often. And to kind of summarize that, and, heavy trigger warnings for this subject, but if you pick up a woman at a bar and take her home, get undressed, and find that she has a penis, it is legally recognized as self-defense in 38 states if you beat her to death. That's a legal defense, because the sight of a penis is so traumatizing to men that the only reaction is to beat somebody to death. And I think that's largely a factor in where some of the support for these, bans on trans people using the correct or corresponding restroom to their gender is the belief that trans people are going to behave that way. That trans people are going to do to cis people what cis people have historically done to trans people. And there's not really any supporting evidence for that. But you hear the argument made for a whole slew of other subjects. Men not wanting women to gain power because they don't want to be treated how women have been treated historically. People not wanting ethnic and racial minorities to gain power over ethnic and racial majorities because they know how they have treated these other groups historically and don't want to be treated that way. And the expectation is, if I do something to you, if the tables turn, you are always going to want to do that same thing to me. And I don't think that's the case for a lot of people. But I think a lot of people project their own self-criticisms onto other people often.
It's that blanketing othering, where you say, well, this group of bad actors, these very, 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 very small number of people that did this thing, we should then blanket everybody else that looks like them, identifies like them, as being the same as those very small number of groups of people, right? So you say, so there's a very small group of like 1 or 2 cases in the United States, I think it is, of a trans woman going into a bathroom and assaulting someone else, right? Like 2 cases in the entire United States. That's 2 cases out of 330 million people. Excuse me. But then society wants to blanket those bad actors' actions onto every other trans woman. And I find that, again, despicable and gross. It's horrible. It's a horrible practice that us human beings have gotten in the habit of doing.
And at the same time, they want to project that behavior onto all trans people while carrying the banner of not all men, or
right. Yeah. Go ahead, Max.
Everything you are saying, Barrett, I fully agree with, and I'm very excited you said it because now I can piggyback off of it. The fear of the unknown is such a detrimental thing to the society that we live in because of exactly what Barrett was saying. I'm losing my train of thought. Oh no, it's getting late. It's people are so worried that they are going to be treated the way they treat other people. And that does say such profound things about how we view knowledge in the society. It's othering. It really is. I remember being taught as a kid, treat people how you want to be treated. And if they are worried about people treating them the way women have been treated, or trans people have been treated, or racial minorities have been treated, that says a lot about their character, that they are willing to treat people to that poor degree, or at least to a subconscious degree. And what can we do to break that cycle, to break that generational trauma of, well, obviously if we're treating all these people this way, obviously they're going to want to treat us the same way. What can we do to reverse that?
Yeah. What are your guys' final words? Because we're at the 2-hour mark. I usually like to stop around there, and we can always, do this again, and we can add more questions and stuff like that. And as a matter of fact, I'd like to offer everybody here an opportunity to come back and discuss the things that they want to discuss instead of just answering other people's questions. But the whole goal of this was to try and connect people who believe they're so different, but really they're actually not. We're just told a certain number of things, and we're told to not like other people because of who they are, how they identify, and their political and sexual, identification, identifiers and stuff like that. And so, what are you guys' final thoughts today on what we've discussed, and where you would like to see the future of trans rights and trans activism? Where do you want to see it go? We'll start with Sam. Since we started with Parrot the very first of the show, we'll start with Sam this time.
Sure. I'm an idealist in many ways and a pessimist in most. So ideally, I'd like to see that everybody has the same opportunities, that everybody has the same rights and the same social standings. But at the end of the day, I also recognize that humanity is humanity. So the idea of a utopia will never really exist. That's my pessimism coming out, because we always want to strive for more when we don't have. And when we have, we're content. So those that continue to strive because they think that there's something else they could have may surpass those that are now content with the things that they already have. There is no perfect ideal situation, but what we can do is we can work towards basic kindness. Whenever I hear a discussion around, say, video games, for instance, if there's a good and an evil track in a video game, which side does somebody enjoy playing? So many people enjoy playing the evil route, and the reasoning I hear is so they can do the things that they don't get to do in real life. Like, cool, I'm glad that you have that outlet. I don't like to do the evil route pretty much ever because it just makes me feel bad. I mean,
I'm the same way.
Yeah.
I'm the same way. Like, I love Darth Vader, but I will always play a light side, force wielder, always.
Absolutely. But I'm not going to diss on somebody that enjoys to pull the dark route, the evil route, whatever, because there is a place for that in our society where that is a net positive gain. But how we treat each other, that I think that being supportive and being positive for things that don't negatively impact others, we can probably universally agree on. That is a good thing.
Sorry, Max?
I would love to see something that I learned in the last few years was the difference between equality and equity. And I feel that if a few more people knew the difference, there would be a beneficial sway. And I am the most painful, pessimistic optimist ever. And I kind of agree with what Sam is saying, but in the same vein of where we can't guarantee that what we're doing is going to change anything, it's going to leave a lot of people more informed than they would have been otherwise. And that is bringing the divide closer together. So where us four can't change, just the view of trans rights and everything like that, but we can still climb up a few pegs on the uphill battle that we are facing. And I believe that if we bridge that gap and bring enough people together, that in the end, there actually could be a positive outcome to it. Even though it's unlikely, it's still there.
Okay, I guess that means it's my turn. I mean, outside the obvious, I would just love to see, or I guess the obvious would be that I would love to see, trans people kind of getting to experience life as any other human, especially in an equitable and just positive manner. It would be super rad not having to worry about being assaulted on the street, or fired from jobs. I mean, I can't tell you how many stories I've read of trans people being denied medical service after being in an accident and dying on the scene, because people didn't want to touch them to administer aid. I would love to see an end to that way of thinking and that kind of existence that we're pigeonholed into. And there's a whole number of steps I think we can take in that direction, even just in the immediate future. But I think conversations like this definitely help to, show that we are people just like anybody else. And I hope that it kind of erases some of the otherness that we are kind of pushed into. I try and kind of push out some of that kind of fog of war, so to speak, with the people around me in my day-to-day life. And I appreciate this opportunity to kind of dispel some of that to a wider range of people that I wouldn't probably normally interact with for whatever reason. I'm getting kind of hermetic in my older age. No, I think, to joke, I think there's an expression, fully automated luxury gay space communism would be, no, in all seriousness though, like, ideally speaking, a world where everybody, has all their needs met and gets to exist as they are and not as, other people want them to, I think would be a pretty rad thing to work towards. And I hope in my lifetime I'll see it, but I don't know that that's necessarily the case. So leave it better for the people coming behind me.
I mean, that's the best thing that we can ever hope for, right? I can't thank everybody here enough for coming, both the panelists and the viewers, and taking the time out of your day to participate in this endeavor. I'm really passionate about really, bridging the gap and helping bring it a little bit closer together so that the world isn't so polarized, because at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to happen is that we become further and further and further apart. And history tells us that never generally ends up good. Usually it ends in violence. And I don't think anybody wants that. But at some point in time, we have to have a conversation, and we have to have a conversation about the things that matter to us. My passion is giving people voices and talking about issues that we know need to be talked about, but for some reason remain polarized. You know, we always have to sit in our seat and defend our seat at all costs, even at the cost of admitting things that we know are not true. And so part of this series is giving access to people who don't think like us, and giving them access to the opportunity to learn and to grow and to have conversations that are, meaningful and beneficial and productive, instead of just believing everything that we consistently hear in the news and media and social media, and telling us that I'm supposed to hate every single person on here. And that's a daily thing that we all seem to see, because most media platforms are biased. They are designed to cater to our biases. The algorithms that Facebook and Twitter all use are there to cater to our beliefs. Our epistemic bubble is created by these social media companies. And so it's important for us to go onto platforms like this, like others, like Critical African Thinkers, my friend Charles, who's an amazing human being and runs his show, Coach Erico Love, Dr. Sheena Mason, just all these really amazing people that are having really complicated, not even necessarily complicated, but very controversial topics, and just having the courage to come forward and talk about these things. I can't commend everybody on this panel enough. Thank you so much for coming today and having this discussion with us and with the viewers. And I just can't voice my appreciation enough for each of you, because I know each of you, and I know each of you personally, and I love you guys. I care about you, and I care about your safety and your well-being. And trans people are people, and we need to stop allowing society to other people that just because they don't look like us don't deserve the same rights or respect or privilege. So I want to say thank you for everybody for coming, and everybody on the panel, hang on there. Don't leave the studio. I'm going to end the broadcast and we'll have a chat after we're done. But I want to say thank you to everybody. Musical Compass, it's always good to see you. I love seeing that guy. Cody, thank you for coming. Even if it was just to type in a couple of comments, would love to have you on the show next time. Because I believe that, you know, from speaking to you, you have a valuable experience that we could draw upon as well. And I appreciate everybody just being very candid with your responses. And Sam, it looks like you'd better get that boy to sleep, because he's about ready to fall asleep sitting in that chair. So I appreciate everybody's questions, and I'm going to actually go back and write all these questions down in the comments that we didn't, get to, because a lot of them were great questions. But thank you everybody for coming, and I appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.